This video shows the last portion of a trip to the Greek islands in the spring of 2007. We visited 8 Greek islands and the mainland city of Athens. This is part 2 of 2 parts, where we cover the last 6 islands we visited. The part 1 video covers the first 2 islands we visited. Our adventures in this video begins as we leave Rhodestown and take a high-speed ferry to the island of Chios. The ferry made an intermediate stop on Samos Island. The high-speed ferries around the Greek islands are of a catamaran design. They can carry 3 or 4 cars as well as passengers. These are big catamarans. They go fairly slow inside the breakwater, then accelerate to about 35 miles an hour. Our route today took us very close to the Turkish mainland. It felt like I could throw a rock and hit Turkey. Our ferry made an intermediate whistle stop on the island of Samos. Most of these islands depend on tourism for income. These ferries are a vital link to provide the provisions they need. After a 20-minute stop, we were on our way again. Most of the Greek islands we saw looked quite barren. Again, we passed within stone-throwing distance of Turkey. Finally, we arrived at the island of Chios. It was overcast and windy when we arrived. Our room was on a side street and had a balcony. There was a communal kitchen for the guests. We fixed our breakfasts in the room and ate out on the balcony. There are several mosques located in this town of 15,000. There is a nicely sheltered harbor here. Day trips to Turkey are a favorite here. Many sailors enjoy island hopping in their sailboats. This is the castle of the Knights. This almost impregnable fortress was the Knights' biggest defense against the encroaching Ottomans. The castle was built in the 14th century, damaged by an earthquake in 1495, and then restored in the 16th century. The castle has massive outer walls and an inner keep. At one time, there was a moat around it. We visited the archaeological museum. The most renowned statue is that of Hippocrates. They had a marvelous collection of mosaics. This is Pan. A few of the locals are of the Muslim faith. Most of the merchants spoke English. The island's most important archaeological site is 3 kilometers out of town, up a long hill. Many tourists take this little train up there. Others bicycle up. We took a city bus. The ancient site of Asclepion was our objective today. It is located on a pine-covered hill. The Asclepion consists of a religious sanctuary to the god of healing, a healing center, and a school of medicine. People here were trained in the teaching of Hippocrates. Hippocrates is the first known doctor to have a rational approach to diagnosing and treating illnesses, until AD 554, when an earthquake destroyed Asclepion. People came from far and wide to be treated here, as well as for medical training. From the top, there is a wonderful view of Kos town and the Turkish coastline beyond. The next day, we headed down to the harbor with our luggage to catch a fast ferry to the next island of interest to us. The ferry docked near the fortress. We planned to travel from Kos Island to the small island of Patmos, further north. Our fast ferry left on time and made a brief in-between stop on the island of Kalymnos. There was an interesting structure on top of a hill. A lot of people were getting off and on here at the island of Kalymnos. It is said this island has good food, good accommodations, and good rugged scenery. As usual, a lot of food for the island and its restaurants were delivered by ferry. After a short stop, the ferry was ready to continue its trip. It left the dock like a sprinter leaving the starting blocks. There was another 10-minute intermediate stop on the island of Leros, and then we arrived at our destination, the island of Patmos. The fortified monastery at the top of the hill behind the town was the major landmark. We had a bite to eat at an outdoor cafe before proceeding to our room. It was one of the worst rooms of our trip because the whole place felt damp, and the bedding felt damp. We decided to stay only one night. The island of Patmos is the ideal Greek island destination for some people. It is a small island with lovely beaches, culture, food, shopping, and religious history. The main town is Skala. It has a lovely protected harbor. The primary reason we stopped here was to see the monastery of St. John. The local bus makes the 2-mile winding trip up the hill 3 times a day. Our bus ride was standing room only. Our busload included a number of loud-talking Italians. The view of the city from up here was great. There's a narrow walkway up to the monastery. Just outside the main entrance to the monastery is this little chapel. No ladies are allowed into the monastery wearing shorts, but one-size-fits-all skirts were available on a loan basis. They are blue in color. The monastery of St. John is noteworthy for the fortified walls around it. These walls were to protect the inhabitants from pirates. We didn't have a lot of information about the monastery. Its frescoes were the main attraction. We wandered around the corridors that were open to the public. Two photogenic monks sat and made certain the crowd did not get out of hand, and they didn't mind being photographed. We left the monastery and started a walk down a path in the direction of town. We could see where the locals used to have agriculture, but they gave that up in favor of the more profitable tourism. The objective of our walk was to visit the cave in which St. John the Divine lived for several years. He was banished to Patmos in AD 95. It was here that he wrote the book of Revelations. In the cave you could see the triple fissure in the ceiling from which the voice of God issued. That afternoon we waited at a ferry dock for our next ferry. It was to be a strange, sleek-looking, beetle-like hydrofoil. At full speed its hull is raised out of the water. When it slows down, the hull drops back into the water. As at most ports, there were people waiting to meet incoming ferries, advertising rooms they had to rent for the arriving passengers. Sorting out the luggage piled just inside the ferry's door took up most of the time in port. The ferry idled out through the breakwater. You can see a sort of a wing sticking out up front. We watched the monastery from the rear of the ferry as the ferry left the harbor. Finally, the ferry powered up to full speed. The hydrofoil ferry travels at about 40 miles an hour. The ride was a bit rough, but we enjoyed the fresh air at the back of the ferry. It seemed like we were traveling very fast. We had left the island of Patmos and were heading to the island of Samos. On arrival, Margaret had a cup of coffee before we rolled our bags over to our room at the family-run Pension Despina, a couple of blocks from the harbor. We had landed at the town of Pythagorio. The town was built on a gentle slope, and we were on a quiet street. Our room had a balcony which faced an inner courtyard. The town has a population of 1,300. It has an upscale feel to it. We took a walk to the outskirts of town to see the Eupalinus Tunnel. It is a remarkable feat of precision engineering. It was dug in 524 before Christ to channel mountain water to the city. The tunnel is more than a half-mile long. The diggers laboriously chopped through the mountainside, beginning at each end and finally meeting at the middle. Access to the tunnel is a very constricted stairway. We didn't go down there. We were in Pythagorio 2 nights. We had dinner both nights out in the open, a half block from our room. The most important archaeological site near town is the Heraion. We took a local bus 5 miles to the site. It is now listed as a World Heritage Site. The legendary birthplace of Hera is Samos Island. Every goddess needs a sanctuary, and this one was built in the 6th century BC on swampy land. There had been a temple on this site since the Mycenaean times, but the Heraion was different. It was enormous, 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens. This was the largest temple ever designed by the Greeks. It was so large that it never got finished by the dictator who initiated the project. As a result of plunderings and earthquakes, only 1 column remains standing. This was the so-called Sacred Way. It led from the city to the Heraion. At one time, it was flanked by thousands of statues. The surviving original statues are on display in the Samos Museum, which Margaret visited later. The site was monitored by 3 guards to make certain that tourists didn't damage the remaining stone. Since we were almost the only visitors that day, our every step was watched. They wouldn't let me use my tripod. The town of Pythagorio has a nice little harbor. I enjoyed walking around it during the early morning hours and watching the activity. Out on one of the jetties is a memorial to the mathematician Pythagoras, the namesake of the town. The town beaches are not sand, but pebbles and small rocks. The next ferry we wanted to take left from the north shore of the island, so we took a local bus from Pythagorio to Samos town on the north shore. We pulled our roll-along bags easily over the city streets. We each had only one roll-along and one additional small day pack. We traveled light. We arrived at the bus stop and waited for the local bus. The bus ride was about 25 minutes long. The ticket taker spent much of his time talking with a young lady. Our fare was €1.50. As the bus came down out of the hills, we began to see the town of Samos. Samos town is the island's capital. We called our hotel and they sent a small van to pick us up at the bus station. Our book had recommended Hotel Pythagoras. Its street-side appearance was dull. However, it was located almost on the waterfront. Our room had a narrow balcony which looked out on the bay. It was a great place to relax and write in a diary. There was a nice, small, sandy beach just below and to the side of our room. We could watch the boats and ships coming and going from our room. Margaret wanted to visit the main attraction in town, the Archaeological Museum. The museum was only about a 4-block walk from the waterfront, past the municipal garden park. We had a little difficulty finding it because we didn't see any signs pointing the way. It is one of the finest museums in the Greek islands. The collection includes many statues, mostly from the Hieraion, bronze sculptures, stela, and pottery. Margaret visited the museum alone. She took a few photos of the exhibits. She was particularly interested in the large Chios discovered at the Hieraion. It was the largest Chios ever produced, 16 feet high. While Margaret visited the museum, I spent time at the colorful waterfront, taking photos. Clearly, there are still many serious fishermen here. There was plenty of color and activity to photograph in the bright sunlight. In the evening, there was a nice sunset to film from our hotel room's balcony. The next morning, we went to the ferry terminal to arrange our next trip. Here we learned that one of the ferries we wanted to take wasn't working just now, so we had to adjust our plans to fit the best schedule we could find.
Something is wrong, but maybe I think the boat it's kind of bankruptcy or something like that. That's why the boat is not running anymore. So you have the privilege of seeing me again. So you have to come back.
Our next ferry ride would be on a large ferry that went from the far south to the far north of the Greek islands, stopping at many islands along the way. It carried a lot of cargo and people. We were beginning to be old hands at this island hopping. There always seemed to be a few latecomers, but no one got excited or acted rushed. Ferry prices are fixed by the government. Prices are influenced by the distance of the destination from the port of origin. Sometimes ticket agents may advertise discounted prices, but the discount seldom amounts to more than 50 cents, and they sacrifice that off their designated commission to qualify as a discount service. The ticket prices include embarkation tax, a contribution to the Seamen's Union, and a 10% value-added tax. I always enjoyed one last look at the city as the ferry left. And there were those last-minute organizing chores. I had not realized how many trees there were on the north side of Samos Island until that trip out. We were looking now for an island to visit that lacked a lot of tourism, where we could just relax for a few days. Chios was our choice. This was a 4-hour ferry ride north to the island of Chios. We arrived at Chios after dark. This was the first time we'd ever arrived at night. It was interesting to experience the arrival at this time of day. The ferry disgorged its passengers and freight, took on the new, and left the dock about a mere 10 minutes after it touched land. Chios was not an important stop. We rolled our bags the length of the waterfront to our pension, which was up one steep, curving flight of stairs. Margaret had not slept well during the night. There was too much noise from the street and from a desperately hungry, abandoned kitten meowing someplace just outside our window. We talked to the manager of the pension, and he recommended a quiet place for us to stay further south on the island. He called ahead for us and made a reservation. So we checked out, struggled getting our bags down the stairs, rented a car, and drove from Chios town to the village of Emporio. The village of Emporio is on the ocean with a fairly exposed waterfront. There are no big tourist developments here. Our small hotel, though, was built recently. It had some lovely rooms facing out on a quiet street. It had a swimming pool that looked very enticing. However, a German engineer guest warned us not to swim in it. There was a swimming beach about a 10-minute walk from our hotel. There was no lifeguard. The beach featured rounded black pebbles and stones. Nevertheless, there were people sunbathing, lying right on the stones. Margaret had a good time swimming in the buoyant, warm ocean water. There was a little snack bar just off the beach. If we'd stayed here more than 3 days, Margaret would have been swimming every day in this cove. In the evening, we had a nice dinner in this outdoor cafe, just beside the harbor, about a 3-minute walk from our hotel. It had several cats walking around our feet. We made several trips to the interior of the island. This was a fishmonger's truck. It's fun to look down the side alleys. The fishmonger made a sale and added 1 fish for good measure. Our hotel was at the southern village of Emporio. We took a 1-day trip to the town of Pyrgi. On the way, we stopped at a village that produced mastic. Mastic is a gum material made from resin from the mastic tree. The fortified village of Pyrgi is one of the most extraordinary villages in the whole of Greece. Pyrgi is unique because the building facades are decorated with intricate gray and white designs. The designs are created by making layers of white and gray material then scraping off parts of it with the bent prong of a fork. We noticed swallow nests up under the eaves. The town was interesting from a sociological point of view also. The men seemed to congregate in small groups and talk. There were no women in these groups. The men were totally idle. I think this behavior is typical of the culture in most of the Greek islands. The women tended to sit alone, or if they were in small groups, they were often busy working at some task.
Ready?
No.
Να καθαρνούμε, με 90. Μας κοστούσε 90 πουλί.
Some of these women's faces were really interesting. Some of the narrow streets have vaulting over them. This is the church of Agios Apostolos. We happened onto an interesting man who had spent some time in the United States. What are you doing in Chios?
Chios is my grandmother and father had this little house. And also is the place where Christopher Colombo discovered America. That's the only reason I'm here.
No, wait a minute.
We were talking about America,
Yeah?
but going to the little square, to the middle square, on the left, you will see an Spanish something there.
Yeah.
There used to live the parents of Christopher Colombo.
Really?
Did you
Were
know
they
that?
from Chios? I thought they were Italian or from Genoa.
The parents of Christopher Colombo were from here. They found papers in the public bibliothèque of Spain in Madrid, I think. They have the proofs, and there is a book in English also, if you find it in Chios, who explain with proofs why he was also from Chios, because he was a traveler. He was staying in Spain 3 years, in Italy 5 years, in Chios. Chios used to be the biggest commercial seaport of the world.
Yeah.
Istanbul, Chios Mediterranean, and Atlantis for me, for my...
The man showed us this passageway. He said it was the narrowest in town. We spent a pleasant 2 hours nosing about the town of Pyrgi before returning to our hotel. The next day we drove from our hotel down south to the center of the island to visit the Neamoni Monastery. It is located in a beautiful mountain setting. It is inside fortified walls, which were meant to keep the pirates out. The monastery was undergoing extensive renovations while we were there, and most of the buildings were closed to visitors. It was built in the 11th century and is a World Heritage listed site. In 1822, the buildings were set on fire, and all the resident monks were massacred by the Turks. There's a macabre display of their skulls in the monastery's little chapel. These were the domestic quarters for the monks, quite tiny. It was not possible to view the important mosaics located here due to the renovation in progress. On our way back to the hotel, we made a slight detour to look up at the abandoned town of Anavatos, built on a precipitous cliff. The residents all perished at the hands of the Turks in 1822, just like the monks in the monastery had. On our last full day on Chios, we visited the fortified village of Mesta. It is completely enclosed within massive fortified walls. We spent some time wandering through the maze of narrow streets. I got lost several times. The cobbled streets and bare stone houses and arches have a melancholy aura. There's a sunny central area. The entrance to the village is through only one of 4 gates. This limited access and the disorienting maze of streets was kind of a 14th century defense architecture. The next morning we planned for a rather long ferry ride. We would travel from the island of Chios back to the island of Samos, wait an hour or so, and then catch a ferry from Samos to Mykonos. Our ferry left Chios 15 minutes late, but we still had plenty of time to catch the ferry at Samos to Mykonos. We could see the hotel room we'd stayed in Samos as we left the port. There were quite a few cars on board. We arrived in Mykonos at night. Mykonos is a favorite tourist destination with white houses and waterfront activities. The inner waterfront leads to the Little Venice neighborhood and the town's famous hilltop row of fly-blown windmills. The narrow alleyways of the inner city wiggle between white-walled buildings. The sidewalks look like a web of white paint. Many travelers I've talked to place this as one of the top 2 or maybe 3 islands they visited in Greece because of the town's picturesque nature and the vibrant nightlife. One can get lost in these snaking alleyways. Huge cruise ships dock here every day and drop off their thousands of passengers. The passengers are bussed and then dropped off a short walk from the town center. They come walking along a beach and sidewalk that passed right behind our hotel. Our room looks out over the harbor. We had that upper corner room. Just outside the Hotel Delos front door, there were often 2 men seated on a window ledge, drinking multiple bottles of beer and watching the crowd. Passengers returning to their cruise ship became a little disoriented and took the sidewalk that passed in front of our hotel. This sidewalk did not connect with the sidewalk that ran along the beach back to the bus. So most of them walked down a few stairs, tried to avoid the seawater, and crossed the sandy beach to get to the correct sidewalk back to their ship. But the cruise ship passengers kept coming like lemmings heading to the sea, right below our room, and the awkward stair situation. It was amusing to watch their confusion and decision-making process. Eventually, they were bussed back to their cruise ships in the distance. The small island of Delos is a 30-minute boat ride from Mykonos. The island has one of the most important archaeological sites in all of Greece. Delos was the reason for our stop in Mykonos. Delos won early acclaim as the mythical birthplace of the twins Apollo and Artemis. It was first inhabited in the 3rd millennium before Christ. In the 8th century BC, a festival in honor of Apollo was established. The oldest temples and shrines on the island date from that era. The yellow flowers along the paths, though, date from today and made their point on our legs as we walked by. In 478 BC, the Athenians were in full control of the island and established an alliance known as the Delian League. It kept its treasury on this island. A cynical decree ensured that no one could be born or die on Delos. This strengthened Athens' control of the island by expelling the native population. Delos reached the height of its power in Hellenistic times, becoming one of the 3 most important religious centers in Greece. It was a flourishing center of commerce. Many of its inhabitants were wealthy merchants, mariners, and bankers from as far away as Egypt and Syria. They built temples to their homeland gods, but Apollo remained the principal deity. The Romans made Delos a free port in 167 BC. This brought even greater prosperity to the island, due largely to a lucrative slave market that sold up to 10,000 people a day. During the following century, as ancient religions lost their relevance and trade routes shifted, Delos began its long, painful decline. By the 3rd century AD, there was only a small Christian settlement on the island. In the following centuries, the ancient site was looted of many of its antiquities. Much of its stonework and fittings were pillaged for buildings elsewhere. The island became a pirate lair during the Ottoman period. It was not until the Renaissance that its antiquarian value was realized. This is the Terrace of the Lions. These proud beasts, carved from marble, but replicas here, were presented as an offering to Delos in the 7th century before Christ to guard the sacred area near the Temple of Apollo. Mount Kythnos rises to 350 feet above sea level. There are terrific views from up here, but it is very windy. Many of the mosaics on the island were inside house courtyards, and the quality of the mosaic was a status symbol for the occupant. No one is allowed to overnight on Delos Island, except for a few caretakers and guards. The next day we took a long-distance ferry ride from the island of Mykonos to mainland Greece and the city of Athens. From there we took a high-speed ferry to the island of Aegina for a day visit. A 40-minute trip by hydrofoil got us to Aegina. Then we caught a local bus for the 5-mile trip to the Temple of Apphia. It was a nice bus ride with pretty scenery. Every time the bus passed a church, some of the passengers made the sign of the cross. The Temple of Apphia is impressive. It was built in 480 before Christ and celebrated a local deity of the pre-Hellenic times. At one time, the temple's pediments were decorated with splendid Trojan War sculptures. Most of these were spirited away in the 19th century. Apphia was the protector of women. The temple was erected on the foundation of a former sacred place. I sometimes look at the straight or slightly curving architectural lines of the structure. This beautiful spot has a long history of people living here. People were known to live here in the 4th millennium before Christ. The building had an advanced method of collecting rainwater in this parched landscape. The water coming off the roof came down into here and then into a cistern. Germans had been responsible for a lot of the restoration work on the site. This was the only place on our trip that Margaret found descriptive signs in the German language. The Germans had built a model of the temple as it once existed. This model helped us understand the layout of the site. Replicas of some of the statues that used to ordain the temple were displayed. We took the bus back to the harbor and then boarded the hydrofoil ferry back to the mainland. The seating was in airplane-style seats. As we entered the harbor near Athens, we encountered a steady stream of ferry activity. Our room in Athens had a number of amenities. We had a sink, a stove, and a refrigerator. We had a little balcony with chairs and a table. We were within extended walking distance of many of Athens' more important sites, like the Parthenon. We had each seen the Parthenon on previous trips. This time, though, we were disappointed because there was so much renovation and construction activity going on around it. In addition, we just weren't quite up to all the hordes of tourists around us, and they just kept coming. We were intrigued, though, as the workers were using heavy-duty, modern equipment to move some of the big building block stones. We marveled, how did the Greeks do it in ancient times? They put building blocks like this way up high on their buildings, and there were those carved stone artworks placed up high. Nearby is the Erechtheion, with the popular 6 maidens who support its southern portico. Fortunately, this building was not undergoing restoration. There's a little theater just down the Acropolis from the Parthenon. It was undergoing some restoration also. In the distance, we could see another Parthenon-looking structure. It is the temple to Hephaestus. The temple seemed quite complete. It even had a roof. When we got to the temple, we found workmen up a ladder on the side of the building. It turns out they were gardening, doing a little weeding. The sculptures here needed a little cleaning up. The birds, I'm sure, were causing a lot of the damage. I felt this temple was quite impressive. The temple was located in the ancient Agora. This is the 11th century Church of the Holy Apostles, also located in the ancient Agora, or marketplace. And our next destination was the Keramikos. It was the city's cemetery from the 12th century before Christ to the Roman times. The Keramikos is one of the more green and tranquil of Athens' ancient sites. It was a place Margaret spent an hour exploring. There were many interesting sculptures and statues. There are tombstones to commemorate the young men who were killed in wars. In the center of Athens is Lykovitos Hill. We didn't visit it. When Athens started to build its subway system recently and started digging, some ancient treasures were discovered. This is a display in a subway station of one of their findings. These are terracotta pipes from the 5th century before Christ, used in this water system. The exhibit showed how the pipes were used and where the pipes were found. We took the subway to most of our destinations in Athens. This is the National Archaeological Museum. It houses the important finds from Greece's archaeological sites. Margaret did not like these modern statues dancing around in front of a museum devoted to the antiquities. Inside, Margaret liked this statue of a siren. A favorite tourist attraction in Athens is the changing of the guard. It takes place at 11 in the morning every Sunday. To view the more complete coverage of this event, enter Franklin Clay Films Greek in the YouTube search box. We had spent 5 weeks in Greece. We visited 8 Greek islands and Athens on the mainland. To view part 1 of our adventure, enter Franklin Clay Films Greek in the YouTube search box.